Otherworldly entities are no strangers to Remedy stories. Between the Taken and Spiders in Alan Wake, the Shifters in Quantum Break, or the Hiss and Astral Spikes in Control, we have enough information to write a paranatural bestiary. However, one entity that we know the least about can be found in the deepest caverns of the Foundation. These are the Id, as Dr. Ash called them. The Id are only referenced a few times, mostly in the Ash tapes, so the exact nature of what they are is partly speculation. Let's start with what we know. These creatures appear as rough approximations of a human form, as if someone molded them from the earth. The Id wander these caverns and attack those they come across. While it may be easy to see them as aggressive, they are more of a neutral party. Dr. Ash chronicles that at first, these creatures were curious and polite. To understand what caused their disposition to flip from docile to violent, we must first understand what they are. The description of creatures molded out of the earth itself is by no means rare. This idea can be found all throughout mythological and theological texts, such as the Greek titan Prometheus or the Incan crater god Viracocha. Both of these figures created life by forming them out of clay. One common thread in these accounts is there are two components for this to work. The first is the body made of clay or dust. Formed from the earth, this represents the manifest aspect of life. The breath of the creator is the second component. This represents the aspect of the divine or individual soul. Tanamahuta is a forest god of the Maori faith and was credited with forming the first woman from clay before breathing life into her. In some Native American creation myths, the Earthmaker formed man from the earth and set it out in the sun to dry before breathing life into it. This account can even be found in the book of Genesis. And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. This is relevant because of how Dr. Ash describes the Id. He compares them to golems from Kabbalistic texts. This will likely conjure images of roughly shaped beasts that obey the will of its creator. While this is largely accurate, it is only part of the story. The word golem has several meanings, including unformed mass, unfinished life, or most importantly, a body without a soul. If the clay itself forms a body and the breath of God gives it a soul, then the golem is a creature that has been formed but has not been gifted a soul by the creator. This is why they are said to follow the will of the one who forms it. By applying this concept to the Id, we are left with a question. If these creatures are essentially golem, then whose will is animating them? Dr. Ash again helps to answer this question. In the final audio log from the Ash tapes, he states that they follow the Pillar's orders. The board, it turns out, directs the actions of the Id. This is further proven in the fight with the Hiss-corrupted Marshal when the former sends Id out to assist Jesse in the fight. These particular Id are animated by the former's will. One other piece of supporting evidence is the fact that we have seen a similar creature to the Id way back at the beginning of the game. During the binding ritual for the service weapon, the board creates astral copies to use as target practice. By zooming in, the description of rough sculptures that approximate the human form can be seen. From this, I can conclude that the Id, astral copies, and astral mimics are essentially the same type of creature. This makes the link to the board even stronger. At this point, we have another line of inquiry. What is the mechanism that dictates how the Id respond to the will of the board? I believe a clue to this is found in the name itself. For anyone who has taken an Introduction to Psychology class, the Freudian theory of the id, ego, and superego should be no stranger. Let's do a quick recap though. The id is the primitive, instinctual part of the psyche that exists to satisfy our base urges. These include the fear of death, satisfying hunger, sexual gratification, and the instinct to reproduce. The superego is the aspect of the psyche that provides moral structure to an individual's behavior. It acts as a counterbalance to the instincts of the id. Throughout our lives, we are instilled with a set of rules to live by. Some may learn theirs through governmental laws, through their church, or a respected elder such as a parent or a teacher. Essentially, one focuses solely on your own wants and needs, while the other focuses solely on the morals of a higher authority. The ego attempts to balance these two aspects, allowing one to satisfy their base wants and needs while doing so in a manner that aligns with a moral center. With this in mind, Dr. Ash naming these golem-like creatures id makes perfect sense. Their behavior reflects the unconscious impulses of the ones that animate them, the board. When the FBC first arrived in the oldest house, the board would have been curious about who they were and what they were doing there. As such, the id were curious and examining the work Ash was doing. The more he learned about the nature of the pillar and the foundation, the more nervous the board became. Eventually, they commanded Northmoor to get everyone out. Their base urge now was to get rid of anyone in the Foundation, so the id began attacking the agents, forcing them out. Back during the service weapon ritual, the Astral Copies became shooting practice for Jessie because the board's desire in that moment was to create an arena to test her. Even during the fight with Marshall, the former sends id to help because its instincts were to help the director in the conflict. When focusing on the board as the ego, the Freudian id would be these creatures, behaving in conjunction with their base urges. As previously discussed, when the ego becomes possessed by the id, the individual becomes solely focused on the self. These individuals lack any compassion for those harmed by their actions, and do nothing to hide this fact, as their own wants are all that matter. When someone becomes possessed by anger or lust, we see their id poking out. This is not the case with the board, as we see them civil in conversation even as their id betray their true thoughts. However, if we focus on the id entity as the ego, their relationship to the board is different. When the ego becomes possessed by the superego, they lose any sense of self. The existence of the id in this context is, like all golem, to carry out the will of the higher authority without any thought to their own wants and needs. While this may be an extreme example, we see them act like drones in a bee colony with no sense of individual thought. For this reason, I found it interesting that Dr. Ash felt awkward about giving them names. By giving something a name, you give it an identity, a method of distinguishing itself from the group.
I know I shouldn't, but I gave them names. There's Hercules, Adam, Lilith, Copernicus. Mabel is the bravest.
This is also amusing considering that one of the names Ash gives to the id is that of a known golem in some traditions. In one Talmudic legend, the first man, Adam, was considered to be a golem for the first 12 hours of his existence. At that point, God breathed a soul into him and the golem became human. On a side note, at some point in the story, a member of the board was fired and the former became its own individual. I am curious if this happened around the time Dr. Ash named a few of the id, giving them a sense of identity separate from the group. There are two primary examples of the ego becoming possessed in the story. The hiss represent one side and the board another. Like any virus, the hiss have a base urge to infect and spread. The destruction of thresholds means nothing as long as they obey this instinct. Director Trench started off as human and after being infected, slowly became possessed by these instincts until he opened the slide projector to the hiss. Northmoor also started as human, but as he gained more power, he began to obey the higher authority of the board without question. In a psychological sense, he sold his soul for power and devolved into a golem, obeying the board's mandates. The lesson to be learned here is that through self-reflection, we must make sure our own ego properly regulates both halves of our psyche. By letting it slide to an extreme, we either become a mindless animal or a soulless golem. Either way, we cease being human.